Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Provincial HSJCC webinar. My name is Trevor Timchuk, Chair of the Communications and Knowledge Exchange Committee, and I will be your host today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will conclude at 1 p.m. We will be enabling the chat box shortly. You can leave comments in there. However, to make it easier to go through questions, we ask that you use the Q&A box. There will be a dedicated Q&A period at the end of our webinar. The webinar recording, slides, and resources will be emailed to you soon. It will also be posted to the HSJCC's website and YouTube site. We will hold a few minutes at the end of the webinar for a short survey to hear your feedback from today's session. The survey will also be emailed to you following the webinar. The Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committee network is comprised of 38 local committees, 14 regional committees, and 1 provincial HSJCC. Each HSJCC is a voluntary collaboration between health and social service organizations, community mental health and addiction organizations, and partners from the justice sector, including Crown attorneys, judges, police services, and correctional service providers. Please visit our website for more information. Before I hand it over to Hayden and Nicholas, I would like to take a moment to provide today's land acknowledgement. And I'm in the London area, so that's where it's based on. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Loanapoiak, and Adnyarondan, and the treaties that govern them. We acknowledge that with respect, the history, spirituality, and cultures of the Indigenous peoples with whom these treaties were signed in good faith. This territory includes the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation, and is also home to many Métis and Inuit people, and all of us, both Indigenous and newcomers, are treaty people, equally responsible to uphold the treaties first made here. One of the most overrepresented populations that the HSJCC serves are Indigenous peoples. To me, this is part of the reason that this webinar is so important. When we talk about trauma, when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, when we talk about many of the reasons that bring our clients to our services, we're talking about the effects of not only historic events affecting Indigenous peoples, but also about things that continue to happen today. A decade ago, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada concluded their mandate, and this included 94 calls to action. The word reconciliation has been used a great deal, though the vast majority of these calls to action have yet to be acted upon. At the HSJCC, we deal with issues at both the systems level and the service delivery level, and true reconciliation would involve changes at both levels, and in some cases go well beyond our scope. However, I know from 25 years of involvement, especially with local committees, that we can affect change at the service delivery level, and I hope that we can keep doing that with reconciliation in mind as more than a trendy buzzword. I would love to accomplish that in partnership with friendship centers, both at the provincial level and hopefully across local committees. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today, Hayden and Nicholas from the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers.
Hello. Okay. Nick, are you able to? Perfect. We'll just wait a moment as our PowerPoint loads. Perfect. Thank you, Nick. And hi, everyone. Welcome. First of all, thank you for being here today. We appreciate you taking the time to learn more about friendship centers, and we're excited to introduce or reintroduce them to you. Thank you also to the HSJCC team for having us. We're really happy to be here. And thanks also to Ali, Trevor, and Rochelle for helping us today. So my name is Hayden Moore, and this is my colleague, Nick Hazel, and I'm a senior policy advisor at the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers, and Nick is a senior program advisor, and we're both on the justice team there. Unfortunately, our colleague Janess Manning is unable to present with us today as we had originally planned. So apologies in advance to everyone, and hopefully we don't let her down. So Nick, if we could move on to slide 2. Thank you. So today our aim is a pretty simple one. We would like to introduce you to friendship centers. We're going to tell you about how they came to be, introduce you to the OFIFC's justice programs that are run out of the friendship centers, and also talk a bit about how you can work with your local friendship center or friendship centers. And relationship building is a really important aspect of the friendship center movement. So it's great to have all of you with us today. And we're just happy again that you've joined us. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Nick. So a little bit about ourselves, in case you're wondering what the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers is and why Nick and I are here. So the OFIFC was founded in 1971, and it's a provincial organization that works to support, advocate for, and build the capacity of member friendship centers across the province. We have a variety of departments that supports this work, including research, policy, programs, education, and training. And here's just a little depiction. We could do the next slide. Sorry, Nick. Here's a map. Currently, the OFIFC represents 31 member friendship centers. So this is just to give you folks an idea. You can see them here on the map and hopefully give you a bit of insight into what friendship center or centers are in your local area or region. And I will pass it over to Nick.
All right, thanks, Hayden. And thanks to HSJCC for having us, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. I know it's lunchtime, so we really appreciate you taking the time. As Hayden said, my name is Nick Hazel, and I'm a senior program advisor for justice with the OFIFC. I'm new to this role, but I've been working for the organization for almost 3 years, and over that time, I've really come to care a lot about the centers and the people working there and all the great work that is being done all across Ontario for urban Indigenous people. So, like many people who I think have probably tuned into this webinar, the people that work in the friendship centers are community members, and they're working, to make things better for their friends and neighbors in community, right? They're really helping people realize their gifts and step into their roles in their personal and professional lives and just in community more generally. So we really see this seminar, and I think there's a few more to come where we'll speak more specifically about justice programming. But we see this as sort of a chance to show off the work that's being done in the centers, and that's really making we feel a good difference in urban Indigenous people's lives. So just a little bit about the Friendship Center movement as a whole. As Hayden mentioned, we work for the OFIFC, which in turn works to support the friendship centers, right? So we're not the head office. The OFIFC is not in charge of directing things or telling friendship centers what to do or how to go about things. Instead, the work of the OFIFC in all those different sectors that Hayden had mentioned is really directed by the priorities of the centers themselves. So, as an example, my previous role was as a post-secondary instructor. So, we would develop courses for people that work at the centers that were relevant for their work and help them, professionally develop. So we were hearing a lot of the centers were expressing a need or a want for more courses that were specifically talking about mental health and wellness, which are sort of big issues, in community generally. So that became a big project for that team, right? Getting an accredited diploma or a certificate off the ground. So it's just really an example of how the OFIFC is sort of, the saying is that the OFIFC has 31 bosses. We really work to support all that work that's going on in all these different places. So, as I said, I'm just going to talk for a little bit about the history of the Friendship Center movement as a whole. I'm sure some people are probably familiar with it. Maybe others are hearing about it for the first time. But it really emerged from sort of a grassroots and community-rooted movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. As some people probably know, it was only in 1951 that some of the most egregious parts of the Indian Act were amended. So at that time, it was no longer illegal for First Nations people to gather in groups of 3 or more. leave their reserve without a pass, hire a lawyer, own property, and even practice their culture. So again, that sort of change in the Indian Act came about as a part of this broader human rights discourse in the post-World War II era. So it was only then that those most egregious parts, not to say that there aren't egregious parts of the Indian Act that are still there, but those ones were removed in 1951. So alongside that, there were more and more people moving from reserves to urban centers to look for work or to look for better lives for themselves and their children and their families. A lot of residential school survivors were released from schools and moved or ended up in these urban centers. And they really didn't have a place of their own, right? You can imagine they faced a lot of racism and barriers. So this grassroots movement sort of popped up. Meetings were held in people's basements or in meeting halls or in church basements. You know, they would have tea and talks. And it was really a place where people could practice their culture and traditions in a safe kind of way, and even support each other for things like looking for work or looking for places to rent. You know, hey, I've heard that this landlord, he's okay to rent to Indigenous people. You know, I'll give you his contact information. Again, it's really, there were sites where urban Indigenous communities were created, right? Despite centuries of, you know, government attempts to sort of eradicate Indigenous languages and cultures and peoples. These sites sort of emerged from that context. I'm sorry, I'll try to stop waving my hands around so much, but it's a bad habit. So, and that vision has continued today, right? Obviously, the scope and the day-to-day work of the friendship centers has evolved over the years, but this grassroots or locally rooted mindset really does remain in terms of how work is approached. And now the Friendship Center movement has become one of the country's most significant urban Indigenous service delivery infrastructures, right? I should say Ontario, but there are centers across Canada. There really are places for community members and Indigenous people living in urban centers to gather, to connect with one another, and to receive culturally based or culturally rooted services. So, you know, the centers provide programming in justice, which obviously is our focus today, health, family support, long-term care, healing and wellness, employment and training programs, education, as I had mentioned. So it's really a whole gambit of services. And you can imagine how being able to access services from a place of cultural empowerment or safety really enhances a community's ability or want or desire to access those services, right? So it's why it's so important that, you know, the friendship centers are rooted in community. They're run by community members. They have those connections and that trust with the members of community. And that's really a big part of why they're successful. So, you know, they can come, they can access these services, they can connect with their worldviews, their histories, their identity without, you know, as you can imagine, the threat of racism or discrimination or cultural ignorance of people delivering those services, which, as we all know, is, you know, can be an issue, right? They also develop Indigenous youth. That there's a big push for youth engagement. You may have heard the term, someone may say, I'm a friendship center baby. So you'll hear, you know, an executive director of a friendship center will say, I was a friendship center baby. That means they grew up, they were attending programming as a little kid. They've always been involved. And they, you know, it's really part of who they are. So it's really great to see that. And it's cool when people are proud to say that. And just to point out on the slide here, on the far right, it says any status. So the centers are status blind, right? So they serve any and all urban Indigenous people. Not to get into it here, but there are plenty of ways for people and their families to lose status or be enfranchised over the years. You know, one example that comes to mind is there were numerous gendered provisions of the Indian Act that would sort of be pathways for Indigenous women and their children to lose status. So community members don't need to show a piece of government ID or government sort of recognition to access the services. Really, they're open to any and all urban Indigenous people. So as I think I've sort of been hinting at here, the Friendship Center movement and the centers really looks at urban Indigenous community development and community wellness in a holistic way. Everything you see here, housing and employment, restorative justice, children, community wellness, education and training, all of these things are sort of understood as being interconnected, right? Whether at an individual level for an individual person or at community level more generally. And again, that idea of a holistic approach to wellness or program delivery is going to come up again when we speak more specifically about justice programming in a little bit. So again, not all the centers deliver the same programming because obviously not all urban Indigenous communities are the same, right? They're responsive to local needs. You can imagine that the programming and the needs of Toronto Council Fire, which is right downtown Toronto, might look a little different to Kapuskasing, which is further. Yeah, I can say it's north. It's further north, right? It's more north than Toronto, right? So they're responsive to those local needs. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And really, a good example of a holistic approach to programming that I like to give a shout out to is what's called the Urban Indigenous Homeward Bound program. This is a 4-year initiative, just as an example, that really aims to holistically address barriers that sole parenting Indigenous women face when they're trying to find meaningful employment, when they're trying to enhance their well-being, when they're trying to enhance their prosperity and their children's prosperity, right? So we'll talk about numbers a little bit in a minute, but over a third of urban Indigenous families are lone parents, and most of them are women. So that program embraces the need for key supports such as housing, access to culture, childcare, education and life skills, even transportation, if it's necessary, case coordination, access to health and mental health services, right? So by taking this sort of wraparound holistic approach, it really improves the prosperity not only of those families, but their children and the generations that will come, right? The generations that are yet to come. And again, the goal there is sort of the attainment of family sustaining salaries or family sustaining work. So that's just one example of a holistic way of thinking about wellness and program delivery. But of course, we're here to speak about justice programming specifically. So we thought it would be good to just take a moment to orient ourselves here with some numbers before we get into it. And we think these numbers can be quite eye-opening for some people. I know when I first came across the statistic on the left there, it was quite, I was like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. So obviously, as it says here, 88% of Indigenous people in Ontario reside in urban settings, right? That could be Toronto, Thunder Bay, all that list of places that Hayden had pointed out. This could be far from their home reserve or their home territory. And if you think about urban Indigenous communities, they're diverse, right? They include First Nations people, Métis, Inuit, people that are registered, non-registered, self-identifying people. There are people that were born and grew up in those urban settings, people that have just moved there. Some have deep connections with community and their neighbors, some don't. And, obviously, we know that not all urban Indigenous people are registered, and therefore they can't be represented by First Nations governance, right? So, all that to say is it's important to not to conflate the needs of and the experiences of urban Indigenous people and that of a First Nations person living off reserve, right? So obviously, an urban Indigenous experience and urban Indigenous life is distinct, and we would argue, I'm sure Hayden would agree from the policy side of things, that should be reflected in approaches and policy, right? Think about things that are different in terms of access to services, governance and representation, culture and community, right? These are quite distinct things. And as it says here, specifically urban Indigenous people are one of the fastest growing populations in Canada. From 2016 to 2021, that population rose by 12.5%. So that in a roundabout way, what we're trying to say here is that the work of the Friendship Centers is important and serves a significant chunk of people across the province. So a few more eye-opening numbers specifically related to justice before I turn it over to Hayden. These are recent numbers from a report from 2023. I think you can find the link there at the bottom. As it says here, 3% of the adult population in Ontario are Indigenous, but almost 43% of adults in provincial custody are Indigenous. So, the word overrepresentation is sort of an understatement, right? It's doing a lot of heavy lifting there. And this really speaks to systemic failures and historic and ongoing injustices, right? We can look at things like the impact of colonialism, socioeconomic inequality, bias in sentencing or policing. And as we talked about earlier, if you want to think holistically about these numbers, it's really not just a question of criminal justice, but really human rights and reconciliation, right? Incarcerating Indigenous people at 14 times the rate of the general public isn't very just. So it's important, obviously, to address root causes of these issues, which, as we've pointed out, Friendship Center programming does. And I'm sure many people that are in this webinar do that too in their work. But we can also think about this in terms of Indigenous rights, if you wanted to. If you think about treaties as being foundational agreements, and almost all of them have some kind of clauses related to peace and order, right? That essentially make the argument or say that Indigenous people would play a role in maintaining peace and order in the country or in the place of that treaty, and be part of the justice system. So obviously that's not really been realized to a full extent. So really for those reasons and many more, the importance of these community-led solutions, where Indigenous voices and Indigenous leadership is front and center, and culturally grounded or culturally rooted justice programming can't be overstated. We think it's very important. So with that, I'll pass it over to Hayden, who's going to speak a little bit about some of those programs.
Sorry, thanks, Nick. So yeah, moving on to programming, I guess I first want to flag or note that today we're going to be providing really brief high-level overviews of our programs, and we're hoping that we will be coming back to this space to do more in-depth program-specific presentations over the next little while. So if you're interested in learning more about the programs and doing that kind of deeper dive, we invite you to keep an eye out for those presentations in the months to come. And next slide, please, Nick. Thank you. And so this is a quote from a Friendship Center staff member that we engaged as part of our work in preparation for the recently released Indigenous Justice Strategy. And we think it really captures the essence of the approach that Friendship Centers take to supporting their justice-involved clients, some of which Nick has already discussed, but Friendship Centers take a holistic wraparound approach to each client and try to address the root causes of that person's behavior. And that often includes kind of non-justice issues that nonetheless impact their justice involvement. For example, trauma, family separation, experience in the child welfare system, lack of access to housing, lack of opportunities in terms of education and employment, lack of childcare support, food insecurity, and the list goes on. And so participating in justice programming allows clients to receive supports from the Friendship Center in those other areas while also addressing their specific justice needs. And so just to reiterate that Friendship Centers know that a siloed or narrow approach to justice involvement is simply ineffective. And of course, providing folks with an opportunity to connect, or in many cases, reconnect with culture, to who they are and to where they come from is a really big reason for the success of the Friendship Center programs. And the next slide, please. Thank you. And also with the kind of linking back to some of the numbers that Nick highlighted, this is kind of to draw attention that the work of Friendship Centers supports and or advances a number of the kind of larger provincial or national policy aims and frameworks that seek to not only combat Indigenous overrepresentation in the system, but also increase access to community-led justice responses, increase Indigenous self-determination. And as an example, we've kind of drawn or highlighted calls to action 30, 31, and 38, all of which are around eliminating the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in custody, as well as providing increased access to these community-based alternatives to custody, which friendship centers do. Friendship centers offer pre- and post-charge diversion programs, and also alternatives to custody. And we would encourage everyone who's joined us today to take a look at what programs are available in your area. Because we all have a responsibility to do our part in combating these issues, as Nick mentioned. Overrepresentation is a kind of simplifies the egregiousness of what is actually going on. And it's important for all of us to recognize the role that friendship centers play within the urban Indigenous community and within Ontario's justice infrastructure. And so connecting with your local friendship center or centers, referring clients to them, increasing funding for community-based programs like those offered by friendship centers. Those are all ways that we can work together to advance the calls to action and take an active role in decarceration. And next we have an infographic. We call it our justice continuum. And so this is really just to highlight that throughout the justice continuum, at every juncture, police interaction, throughout the court process, while in remand or custody, probation or parole, and through reintegration, there's an opportunity to connect folks with a friendship center. And again, once they're connected, those people, those clients can access help with system navigation, victim service referrals, peer or group counseling, family unification or reunification, reintegration supports, and so on and so forth. And especially for mainstream organizations or institutions that are that are with us today, I think it's also important, and it highlights one of the reasons that it's important to build relationships with the local friendship centers or centers, because they can really help folks at every juncture throughout that process. And even if, a particular individual is not interested in accessing a specific justice program or it's not available, that also, though, there might be other programs and supports that maybe are of interest to that individual at the friendship center and which can help them to address some of the other needs or issues that they're facing. And Nick, I will pass it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So these are both Indigenous specific intimate partner violence designated programs, which is a mouthful, but I think most people are probably familiar with PAR, or partner assault response. This is a program, I believe it's 12 weeks or something like that. Generally, if someone is in justice involved and it's related to intimate partner violence, often this is offered as an option. If the program is completed, then those charges will be withdrawn. And within the Friendship Center movement, these are two Indigenous specific intimate partner violence programs. So sort of like alternatives to PAR, Kijé Anishinaabe Nin and the Indigenous Community Justice Program. So for both of these, obviously the objectives are the same as mainstream PAR, right? To address that offending behavior through healing and ultimately reduce the risk of recidivism, which is a word that I find hard to say, but that seemed to go okay. But both of these really approach healing from an Indigenous perspective rooted in culture, right? They aim to support clients in their healing journey and help them relearn or get reconnected with culture as a healthy coping mechanism during distressing times. So the idea is that it can be ineffective for mainstream service providers to work on changing the values, the behaviors, and attitudes of an Indigenous client or Indigenous person without addressing culture and, without addressing the role of colonization in perpetuating intergenerational trauma and violence in Indigenous communities. So again, if you have clients or you work with people that are in this sort of situation, we just want you to know that these kind of programs are out there and they're available. I think PAR has a cost associated with it. It's something like $180 or $185. These programs are free. So Kije Anishinaabe Nin, it's a program that works with Indigenous men and male-identified individuals to end violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA plus people. It's an Anishinaabe-Moan word that translates as "I am a kind man." So Indigenous men, or as I said, male youth or male identifying people, enter at the pre-charge stage generally or as conditional sentence. They're often referred to Kije Anishinaabe Nin, or they're referred to the Indigenous Community Justice Program, and then they'll be moved to Kije Anishinaabe Nin. It's a big program. It's a very successful program. It's currently at 24 centers, friendship centers, and 2 delivery sites, so all across the province. And really, it's designed to offer Indigenous men a safe space to begin to understand their roles and responsibilities in ending violence in community in a supportive environment, right? So as we said, we're going to be speaking about this program and others in more detail in those upcoming webinars. But really, it just briefly, it examines the historical influences, things like intergenerational trauma, and really encourages men to bravely reconnect with their traditional roles within community or within family, right? It's built around the 7 grandfather teachings. It's a 12-week program. And as I said, the goal is to reestablish those traditional roles and responsibilities by really recognizing that teachings have never, tolerated violence or abuse of anyone. So I've seen the program. I've been involved with it, and it's, the people running it are very proud of it. It does a lot of great work, and it's really great success story. The second specific, Indigenous-specific intimate partner violence that's offered at friendship centers, not all of them, of course, I think this one is at 6, is called ICJP, or Indigenous Community Justice Program. This has been an option for pre and post-charge diversions to address really the overrepresentation of Indigenous people within the justice system. I mean, like all of these programs, really. But the ethos of the ICJP program is really rooted in Indigenous legal principles, right? It's, by conducting healing circles, the development of a healing plan, and having the accused be responsible for taking responsibility for their actions. It really takes a restorative justice approach. So, in the program, the person and the victim, if possible, and if they want to, would appear before a council of trained volunteers, called a circle, right? Community members who collectively work to address the root cause of that issue, right? Or the offense. The person is therefore responsible to community and is seen as being on this comprehensive healing journey, right? It's a model that keeps individual integrated within community, housed and hopefully maintaining their employment. And it also provides access to them to all these other culture-based programming and services that are offered at friendship centers, right? So it's not done in isolation, right? The idea is to keep people in community and have them accessible and accountable and give them the journey to step back into their role in community in a good way. And again, it has been very successful from what I've heard. There's always a high level of community engagement, and a lot of diversions have come from this program. So I'm going to hand it over to Hayden, who's going to keep us rolling here.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So next we just wanted to highlight our Indigenous court work program. And so it is I believe it's our oldest justice program. And it is currently delivered at 27 sites across the province. I believe we have 43 court workers. And court workers assist with criminal, family, and child protection matters. These are the program goals that are noted on the slide: self-determination, creating awareness, advocacy and networking, and access and referrals. And so the Indigenous court workers, they advocate for clients, they inform them of their of their legal rights. They explain to them what they can expect through the legal process. They explain to them what their obligations are throughout that process. And they can connect them with culturally relevant programming, whether that's in addition to programming that is required through court, or if it's in addition, it can be both programming that the court has required, or if it's other like additional supports that clients are interested in participating in, they're able to make those informed cultural referrals. And since we're here talking specifically about justice, the criminal Indigenous court workers are also, they help, I should say, sorry, more broadly, they help folks complete legal aid applications. And in terms of criminal matters, court workers have a really important role that they play in terms of GLADU advocacy. They are able to provide the court with important information, important insights about both personal or systemic barriers that individuals face, as well as informing the court or the Crown Attorney about the availability of community support and culturally appropriate programming, and also highlighting, why connections to those programmings are important, and why, as Nick mentioned, for example, in terms of Kije Anishinaabe, why it's important for folks to have access to those Indigenous community-based programmings as opposed to some of the mainstream options. A big thing that court workers have done also is kind of raise with the court the issue, for example, of transportation. A lot of Friendship Center clients often find that the lack of transportation options impedes their ability to attend court. And so court workers have been really important in terms of explaining to the court why bench warrants would be harmful, and explain a bit of the context to make the court more comfortable with either issuing a discretionary bench warrant or just providing more insight into the reasons why an individual may not be able to attend in person as the court had expected. And next, Nawagishigan, the Indigenous Youth Wellness Program. And so this is an Anishinaabe word that translates to the center of the universe. This name was gifted to the program through a traditional ceremony offered by the Dryden Native Friendship Center. And the Dryden Native Friendship Center was the pilot site of this program. And they are also doing really, really exceptional things with this program that we hope to discuss in more detail at our program specific presentation. So please look out for that if you're interested in hearing more. The program is currently delivered at 3 sites, and it is a pre and post charge diversion program. It takes a holistic approach in its prevention and early intervention work with urban Indigenous youth. And it recognizes that the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth is a result of a combination of complex factors, and that those include child apprehensions, racism, and violence, all of which have had a generational impact on Indigenous communities and families, and that together these traumas increase the likelihood of Indigenous youth being taken into care, which then in and of itself increases the likelihood of future justice involvement. So this program really aims to disrupt that cycle by introducing youth to cultural knowledge, traditional practices, and by supporting them again from a holistic perspective, supporting them with their physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health and well-being. Clients receive wraparound support, and they can participate in one-on-one supports. They can participate in peer counseling, as well as group-based activities. And really importantly, they have access to land and water-based activities as well. And next slide. Thank you, Nick. Our Indigenous Peer Support Program. So this program is currently delivered at 3 sites, and it provides support and mentorship to urban Indigenous clients reintegrating into the community after release from custody while on a conditional sentence, probation, or parole. And as I'm sure many folks here know, reintegration can be a really difficult time for people. And this program has a particular focus on mental health and addiction support. Program staff are available to help facilitate access to housing, employment, medical supports. They can also help establish or reestablish relationships with family. Peer mentors are a key component of the program, and they're available to assist clients in part by sharing their own experiences and journeys with reintegration. This program also uses land-based activities. They have sharing and healing circles, and clients have access to knowledge carriers, all of which combine to provide meaningful supports to clients and reduce the likelihood of recidivism. And Nick, I'll pass it back over to you.
All right, thanks. So that was a very brief introduction to the Friendship Center movement, its history, and some of the justice programming. That's not all of the justice programming, but it's a good overview of the kind of work that's done. And as we said, I think there are more webinars to come, and in those, we'll get an opportunity to speak more specifically about those programs, how they work, their history, the impacts that they have in community. But if there's one thing that we hope that you'll take away from today, is that it's just the importance of the Friendship Center movement, the value of this programming that is tailored to the distinct realities and needs of urban Indigenous people all across Ontario. So again, often when we talk about the Friendship Center movement or programs, the key question that people ask is like, oh, that sounds good. What should we do? Or like, what are some next steps? Or what can we actually do? You know, and again, there's no simple answer, but we have some suggestions and some ideas. You know, the first thing would be to visit a local Friendship Center, and many you can drop in, or if you can't, you can schedule a meeting, meet people, learn about the programming, learn what's going on, really see those spaces where urban Indigenous culture and community can live. You know, ask them about their justice work, how your services can complement what they're doing, right? Really, just talking and having those conversations is a great first step. Participate in local events. Many centers, they'll have a calendar, they host all kinds of events. So go and join those community gatherings, right? Go to a round dance. Maybe there's a feast or something, you know, again, that's a great way to just start chatting with people and making those connections. Because I think, you know, it's fair to say that everybody, probably most people listening to this webinar are working in the similar sort of community development or community service kind of roles, have the same goal and passion about helping people improve there's definitely a shared commonality. Lunch and learns are a great way. Maybe you can share knowledge or what you're doing and how that could integrate with Friendship Center work. Actually, I think we're running one tomorrow for Friendship Center staff that is about family court, Hayden, I think. Yeah.
Yes, it's about the child protection.
Yeah. So Friendship Center workers are gonna tune into that, and you know, those are great ways of making those connections. And another key one specifically for justice programming is to formalize or think about formalizing those referral pathways, right? Those clear and documented protocol agreements are so important to the functioning and the integration of these community-based and culture-based justice programming, right? So those connections, those formal pathways are super important. You can also get in touch with us, Hayden and myself, or Janess. You know, anyone at OFIFC would be happy to chat and help point you in the right direction. And anything to add there, Hayden?
I was only just going to add to that, you can also go to the OFIFC's website if you want to search to find out information about a particular program or a particular friendship center. You can access it there. And we can put in the chat both our contact information and we can also drop in the OFIFC's website. That's all I would add to that, I think.
Yeah. So that's it from us. You know, we'll say miigwech. Thank you for, you know, sharing your lunch break with us. I think we have time for questions. So
Yeah.
we'll throw it over to Trevor, I think, who's gonna help us with that, or Allie, possibly.
Yeah, thank you, Hayden and Nicholas, for that informative presentation. We'll now move to questions. Hayden and Nicholas will do their best to answer as many questions as possible, so please be patient as we move through your questions. Just a reminder to please submit your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat. Rochelle Larocque, Program Manager of Justice Policy at CMHA Ontario and a member of the HSJCC Secretariat team, will be moderating today's audience questions. So I'll turn it over to Rochelle for the questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Trevor. And thank you so much, Nicholas and Hayden. I've got some questions here. Very excited. I'll start with the first question. How can regional and local HSJCCs meaningfully engage with friendship centers to support their work and advance outcomes for urban and rural Indigenous communities?
Okay. Kind of what springs to my mind right off the bat is some of the things that Nick had mentioned about just engaging with friendship centers more broadly. Maybe it's about doing some of that relationship building work, like reaching out, reaching out to friendship centers, attending at the friendship centers. I think it's also can be difficult. I know friendship centers are, pulled in a million and one different directions. So in terms of having the capacity to engage in some of the meetings, not that it's not of interest to them, but sometimes it's simply not possible due to the other things that they're going on. That's a great question. We're also at the OFIFC, we're available if we can help in any way. And if you have any follow-up questions or would like to discuss that further, Nick and I would be happy to talk to you more kind of offline.
Great, thank you. We've got another question, which is asking if you could please share the 3 sites that offer the Indigenous Peer Support Program.
Okay, also off the top of my head, I believe that is Dryden, Barrie, and I believe it is going to be moving to Peterborough, would be the 3rd site. Again, if you'd like any additional or further information, please feel free to reach out to myself and or Nick, and we're happy to talk more.
Perfect. We have a comment here. It says that the court workers at the St. Catharines Court are incredibly valuable. They assist in the IPC court and the IPC bail, and Leah is encouraging those to connect with the court workers. So thank you, Leah, for that wonderful comment. Got another question here. What do you see as the main priorities over the near future as programs to expand or build on?
Okay, so I think there might be a bit of difference in terms to some of the friendship centers, what their specific justice priorities might be, and then in terms of the OFIFC, we have our own justice priorities, which are informed by those of the friendship centers. Big ones for us at the moment are GLADU, advocacy around GLADU courts and the Indigenous peoples courts, kind of more formalizing a strategic approach to that. A lot of friendship centers have expressed frustration with the lack of supports offered in terms of both the application process and then in resourcing the court itself. Reintegration has been flagged by friendship centers, kind of similar concerns, the lack of kind of a strategic or focused approach to reintegration. So those are big ones off the top of our head. And then really, well, with the Indigenous justice strategy coming into focus, that's obviously of interest in us to see how that's going to be unfolding and ensuring that friendship centers are part of that. And I think more broadly, it is, as Nick kind of alluded to in his presentation, is our justice work more broadly is informing or reminding people about urban Indigenous populations, and that the infrastructure of the friendship center movement, our 31 friendship centers, and that any justice action, any justice priorities or frameworks, they need to include representation from the friendship centers communities. Nick, not to put you on the spot, but yeah, I think though that for now, we'll go with that maybe.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'd also say it will be interesting to see how things play out with the UNDRIP Act. For those who are familiar, the government of Canada has, I think it's, legislated the fact or legislated that their relationship needs to be in line with UNDRIP. So of course, justice is going to be part of that. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays in. I would also mention I think it's a specific program that's new. It's kind of getting off the ground. It's the human rights. I can't remember the name of it. Indigenous Human Rights Program, Hayden, which it's in only 1 or 2 centers at the moment, but I think it's a great model that I would like to see expanded, across the province, and that's related to, obviously human rights complaints, not specifically Indigenous rights. Yeah.
It's a really really exciting program, and unfortunately, well, we left it out of today's presentation because we're planning on speaking about it at one of our program specific presentations, but it's the Indigenous and Human Rights program, and through that we work with Pro Bono Students Canada to run 2 human rights clinic. One is run out of the Thunder Bay Indigenous Friendship Center, and one is in Ottawa. And clients there are able to access free summary legal advice. And then there's also a public legal education component to that, which is about informing communities about their Indigenous and human rights, and encouraging people to be able to identify human rights violations, and letting them know really that there are potential legal remedies and mechanisms for them to use when things do occur.
Wonderful. Thank you for that really detailed response. Another question we have is around, do the centers typically have lawyers or paralegals on staff to lead or advise the justice programming, or do they work with volunteer lawyers?
Well, it would be wonderful if friendship centers did have paralegals or lawyers on staff. They do not currently, except well, the Indigenous Human Rights Program, which we just mentioned. So that program is run with the support of volunteer lawyers, and they provide the legal summary advice. And that program also runs with the support of volunteer law students from Bora Laskin and I believe the University of Ottawa.
Great, thank you. Got a question around what yourself and Nick would suggest for urban communities without friendship centers to obtain court support workers. Any advice surrounding that?
Without friendship centers, sorry.
Without friendship centers.
Well, even though there's not a friendship center there, that doesn't mean that if there's a local friendship center, it doesn't mean that their catchment area wouldn't cover an area that doesn't have a friendship center itself. I would start there. We're also the OFIFC. We are the largest network of Indigenous court workers, but other agencies do have them. I believe, well, maybe I shouldn't say because I'm not exactly sure, but other Indigenous organizations do have court workers. So that might be another option. Yeah.
So building on that question, Hayden, there's a question here around, there's no friendship center in our area of Ontario. Would there be a way to access the justice programs for First Nation Inuit Métis in their area if there's no friendship center in that area?
Well, friendship centers are, I think that's a little tricky depending on catchment areas. And maybe some of these questions we'd be, again, happy to have a more detailed conversation and get a better understanding of the area and a better understanding of the landscape. And we might be able to answer more meaningfully or more helpfully then. So I would encourage, again, we'll put our contact information in the chat for anyone. Please reach out and we can follow up with these conversations.
Yeah, there's definitely urban spaces in Ontario that we've heard people say, like, how can we get a friendship center here, or there's a need there. So there's definitely space for expansion, and more friendship centers are good. It's just a question of capacity, I think, and having that, develop organically in the future.
Got a question around connection. So this individual states that they work in an institution. What is the best way to connect a person in custody to a friendship center before they're released? Do they need to do an intake before, or can they direct them to a walk-in and find what supports are available to them?
Well, first of all, I would say that we are always looking to help facilitate connections between institutions and the friendship centers. And as I mentioned, at the OFIFC reintegration, this is one of the aspects that we're really interested in. So I would also be interested in maybe talking more about this with you. I would say that a heads up is always appreciated. I think in terms of also just like supporting individuals, it's great if a connection can be established before a person is released. So yeah, I would suggest that.
Got one question around this individual works with a youth involved in the justice system in Northumberland. Would the Peterborough Friendship Center provide service there or not? Not sure if either of you would know that.
Trying to mentally map out where that is.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, I think, but of course, if you want to email us or the center directly, they would, the answer, we could easily find that for you. So yeah, I think our emails are in the chat, and we'd be more than happy to look into that for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got maybe one last one before we wrap up. How can other Indigenous agencies, such as Métis Nation of Ontario, better collaborate with friendship centers to support clients? Or do friendship centers oftentimes collaborate with other Indigenous agencies who may offer similar programming?
Yeah, I mean, I think friendship centers are really there to support the clients and are open to collaborations and connections with Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations if it means that it's going to have more meaningful or better outcomes for clients. So again, in terms of, sorry, I can't remember what we still have the question?
Yeah, would you like me to read it again?
Yeah, sorry.
Sure. How can other Indigenous agencies, such as an example, Métis Nation of Ontario, better collaborate with friendship centers to support clients? Or do friendship centers oftentimes collaborate with other Indigenous agencies who may offer similar programming?
Okay, so yeah, I would suggest, again, kind of, and alluding back to what Nick says, I think it all starts with like reaching out and, trying to establish a relationship, reaching out, like asking for a conversation, again, at the OFIFC, Nick and I, if there's difficulties or you haven't been successful in that way, you can also like feel free to reach out to us, and we can definitely try to support that or fill in a bit of context. We can, again, sometimes capacity is an issue that a lot of friendship centers face.
Yeah, I know that also OFIFC, in a lot of different ways, policy and research has collaborated and continues to collaborate with similar organizations like the Métis Nation of Ontario for producing reports. The Native Women's Association of Ontario comes to mind. So there is collaboration at the OFIFC level that will then sort of directly impact the work of the friendship
And
too.
sorry, and that just reminded me, Nick, friendship centers also have, some friendship centers do have MOUs or protocol agreements with other like Indigenous and non-Indigenous agencies, kind of outlining, shared or similar clients and what referral pathways might look like, what program might be, figuring out what program might be best suited for which each individual. And so that's also where the recommendation of around MOUs and protocol agreements come into play.
Again, that speaks to the importance of friendship centers being autonomous and working in a way that best suits their situation or their environment, right? We know that there's a lot of urban centers that are right next to First Nations, and those connections are made in those spaces, right? I think North Bay comes to mind. They have a lot of work and connections there. So those are sorted out in those community contexts, but also at a higher level within the OFIFC in terms of policy or research or programming collaboration too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for answering all those great questions. I'm going to throw it back to you, Trevor.
Yeah, and thank you, Rochelle, for moderating, and thank you again to Hayden and Nicholas for this wonderful presentation. I want to ask people to take a moment to provide their feedback on today's webinar. There's a survey link to answer that, and thank you everyone for joining us. Looking forward to future presentations from the Friendship Centers. Thank you, everyone.